Hello there. Welcome to Intercept CSA, the podcast, where we break harmful silence with truth, healing, and protection, one conversation at a time. I'm Infon Samson, your host and guide for this conversation. Thank you for joining me. If you have parents or people caring for children around you, please make an extra effort to have them listening. Place your devices beside them. Invite them to lean in. Every bit of awareness counts for children. Now, a gentle reminder before we go any further. This conversation might be triggering. Remember to breathe, pause, and do what feels safe before you return. Hi. Welcome back to our podcast. I just want to take the time to celebrate everyone who is back to listen to this podcast for yet another week. We are 10 weeks in now, and I know there are people who have followed every single episode of this podcast for the last 10 weeks. That is a huge commitment to learning and to growth. Huge one. I was writing a segment in the week 1 training manual for the volunteer community of our organization, Intercept CSA, this week, when I suddenly broke down in tears. I truly needed a moment to collect myself because I articulated the reason for this cause in a way that was so heavy and true to the urgency in my soul that I just couldn't hear myself apart from it and go on to the next line. And as I ponder on 10 weeks and celebrate you for your commitment, I'll take a minute to read that part of the manual to you. The segment has a heading. The heading is, "Why should you volunteer to this cause?" This cause being the mission to intercept child sexual abuse. And here's what I said. I've witnessed a couple of births in recent years. And as I look at the babies laying there, all I think about is how vulnerable childhood is. In that baby is a man. A woman is in there. One day they'll be strong, they'll be powerful, they'll do great things, they'll change the world, they'll dance, sing if they want, lead corporations. But right now, they lay there helpless, completely dependent, waiting for the world to protect them until they can find their voice and then their strength. When adults leave gaps, when children are left unprotected, and they are hurt in childhood, it is one of the biggest betrayals of life. Because no matter how motivated a child is, they cannot protect themselves. And this is what CSA represents, a betrayal. And not just a betrayal by perpetrators, but by everyone who lacks the knowledge required to keep children safe or be true protectors. Child sexual abuse is one of the most devastating violations a child can experience, and yet it remains one of the least talked about. Despite its widespread occurrence, so little is known about CSA, and when it is revealed, it is often ignored, minimized, or misnamed. And it should not be so, because CSA is a deeply life-altering experience. It does not just harm the body, it fractures children's identity, distorts trust, and alters the way a child relates to the world. For many survivors, the abuse goes beyond a single event or any particular date. It becomes a prolonged experience, sustained by silence and met with disbelief or blame. At Intercept CSA, my vision is simple and urgent. It is to make sure it doesn't happen to one more child, to rescue one child in present danger, to support one survivor trying to pick up their lives years later, and to chase/prioritize reaching one, then by so doing, reach many. I believe the true crisis of CSA is that as a community, we don't center children as human beings, and as a result, we trivialize their needs and their violations. We also don't have enough knowledge about CSA, and so we don't know what to do when it occurs. And we are also too afraid to confront what it takes to change. This is why we need volunteers. The work of protecting children cannot be left only to the government, NGOs, or churches. We need people like you, everyday brave people who are willing to interrupt silence and create environments where children are heard, believed, and safe. That's where I ended that. And it really gripped me once the words left me. Because we've seen adults do extraordinary things. Some people with complete visual loss have gone to school and returned excellently. People have done sports on wheelchairs. I saw a man on YouTube. This huge thing had happened to him and it caused him to be divided into two. You can't even imagine it if you've not seen it. And yet he's still powering on in some way. Adults can rise above any challenge and protect themselves when the need arises. But children are vulnerable by every measure. There's only so much a child can do if they're a bit older, and there's nothing little children can do at all. So learning about child sexual abuse and having the tools that can potentially save a child from danger or from harm is beyond just an act of humanity for today. It is a chance that you've given to a man and a woman's future, a chance they cannot give themselves on their own. So I just wanted to take the time before I dive into today's episode to reveal the worth of your listening for these 10 weeks, for these 9 weeks, 8 weeks, even if it's just been once, it's been powerful. If you're a new listener, I'm so glad that you paused to listen to this episode. When you're done here, and if you go all the way back to episode 1, you'll realize how in-depth these episodes are and how much information you can gain about the subject of child sexual abuse by just following our podcast. Hit the follow button if you haven't already, and let's dive right in. This episode is titled, When a Child Tells, How Disclosures Actually Happen. And it's the beginning of our series on disclosures. And to begin, I want you to listen to something very personal. It's a voice note from my dear friend, a lawyer here in Nigeria and listener, Emmanuella Nyong. She shares the first memory she has of a child disclosing abuse, how it was handled, and how she thinks children actually disclose abuse. Listen closely.
So growing up, I had heard quite a few cases or stories of kids who had been abused, and I'll be sharing one of the stories. Now, this story was not directly told to me. It was told to someone else who was closer to the survivor. So let's just say her name was X. X was someone we had known from primary to secondary school. And sadly, her case was one of the all too common stories where the abuser is actually a family member. She was abused by her mother's brother, and from what was told at the time, every time this man came to the house, she was never herself. She was always detached, and somehow her mom had interpreted that to her being disrespectful to this person. There was an incident where he had come home to visit and he didn't want to eat downstairs. Her mom particularly instructed that she takes the food upstairs to his room for him to eat. And it caused a lot of back and forth because for her, she felt like her mom was literally just serving her on a platter to, the same person who was harming her. And I remember listening to this story at, I think, 11 or 12 and just wondering, why would she rather confide in an 11-year-old than talk to her mom, who is an adult, who can literally, walk into that situation and just make him stop the nonsense that he was doing. And when the person that was, close to her had asked the same question, she said her mom would never believe her. Her mom would not take her word over her brother's word. So in a battle of words, hers and then her uncle's word, definitely her uncle's word would definitely win. And it was really sad to hear at the time that this girl was not concealing what had happened to her because, she was, not ready to, she was too shy or she was ashamed of her experience. That was not the main reason. She didn't speak to her family because she had already known that her mom would never believe her. And then it just makes you think, how do kids actually even disclose this abuse? And I realized that most times it's never direct. So while you can have kids that will just walk up to you and say, who can, quickly open up and say, Uncle A is doing this to me, most times it's not direct. So you could see the changes in, the way the child behaves towards this person or how the child reacts when the subject is brought up. But with X, right, there was never a time where her mom had sat her down and said, come, why is it that you always behave this way when this person is around? Let's have a conversation. Like, that was not her story, right? She already felt like her mom was never going to have her back. Now that, it's been a lot of years, I don't know if she finally, could have that conversation with her mom, and just, explain how she felt at the time. I really hope she had, been able to, have the conversation with her mom. But to respond to the other question on how people come to know about abuse, I realized that oftentimes it's not even through the survivors themselves. So a lot of times we hear these stories from others, from friends, from classmates, or even strangers. I mean, how I got to learn about X's story, it wasn't from X herself. I mean, I know that, we were friends, but I didn't hear the story from her. It was from someone else. So we've had so many survivors, have their stories told by people who don't carry their voice. And it's really sad sometimes. But I mean, that's the truth we live in. I mean, that's the reality that we face.
Thank you so much to my friend for sharing that. Her closing lines are a clear articulation of the realities of disclosures when it comes to child sexual abuse. Now, this is what she said. I don't know if you noticed it. We've had so many survivors have their stories told by people who don't carry their voice. And there's so much to unpack in that. Because voice is not just about sound or who it is coming from. Voice is about truth. It is about being able to tell your story in a way that feels authentic to you. To have it said in your own words, in your own writing, in your own timing. So to say that survivors have had their stories told by people who don't carry their voice is also to say that silence robs every child and every survivor of the opportunity to define their own narrative. It takes away the agency to say, this happened to me and this is how I want it to be known, or this is how I want it to be said. So also that recollection creates a very holistic picture of how adults miss or misread signs of abuse. Just imagine that a child is uncomfortable with a family member and it is interpreted as disrespectfulness, and it's not something that people are asking what's going on or the mother is asking, and that's usually what happens. It also helps us to see how adults unintentionally create more opportunities for abuse because they are uninformed about the signs and the situations that should raise their curiosity. In my friend's words, she said it felt as though she was being served as a platter. That's very graphic and very saddening. So it also reveals the kind of environments that children disclose abuse in. And the sad reality is that for most children, the safest place for them to disclose are with other children who can't do anything to help. And I think perhaps the most disturbing part of what my friend shared is when she said it was really sad to hear at the time that this girl was not concealing what had happened to her because she was not ready or she was too shy or she was ashamed of her experience, but that she didn't speak to her family because she had already known that her mother would never believe her. And this is why we are doing this series. Because disclosures, when they happen, don't always look like what you think they would. Nobody, no child, very rare if it does happen. Children don't come to you with the word, I was abused. And if we're not paying attention, if we don't know what to look for, we'll miss it, or worse, we'll dismiss it or misname it. Because misnaming is as painful and as saddening as ignoring it. So before we go into what disclosure looks like, I want to take us back to episode 2 of our podcast, where we asked the hard question, why don't children tell? And the simplest, most important answer we landed on in that episode was this: children don't tell because they are children. And that might sound obvious, but it is actually layered, it's very deep. Because being a child means more than just being young. It means that you're still learning language, still forming your sense of what's right and wrong, still unsure of your voice or what you should even look like in the world. You're not in control, like I talked about earlier in the birth story. You're just in a position where When they lift you from your position, you're in the next. If you've grown a little bit, if it's time for church, you're going to church. If it's time to go to school, you're not in control of the circumstances around you or the conditions around you. You're not in control of your body. You're not in control of your choices. Sadly, too, you're not in control of your safety. And that's what we mean when we say vulnerable. We don't mean that children are necessarily weak, but that they are positioned in such a way that without protection, harm becomes easier. So when we ask, why didn't they say something? We have to remember many times children don't even have the word, or they don't recognize the experience as abuse, or they're afraid of destroying the only relationships they know, especially when the abuser is a family member or somebody that is very up close. Or maybe they tried and no one listened. So that episode 2, was all about how, or the structure of silence. This one is about the speech. It is about the question, how do children speak about abuse, and what happens when a child does try to tell? So what do disclosures actually look like? Contrary to what we expect, children do not disclose abuse like a confession. Very rarely, if such even do exist, would a child just walk up to you in the sitting room or kitchen or as you're about to leave for work and mention that someone is harming them. Many times what you would have would look like a behavioral change, like the person in the story X. Child's behavior just changes. Go take this to your uncle, and a child who used to be okay with that person suddenly doesn't want to do that or associate with them. A child could also disclose abuse through nightmares. Every night they wake up and tell you of a scary story of a family member who is hurting them in their sleep. And something like this did happen to me. Every night I would wake up and I'll tell my mom about this person that I'm literally begging her not to let that person back into our house. So that does happen. That does happen. Or even in school where children draw images depicting abuse, maybe a whole human being with body parts, but a third, and I've talked about this on the podcast before, or a third long arm that they may be using to depict the penis. Or some people have interviewed children who drew a person without arms and realized that they were actually being abused and their drawing was a way to depict helplessness. Of course, that doesn't mean every drawing that looks like that is a message, but these are signs and patterns that observers and researchers and people who are involved in that have noticed over time and noted over time. And those are things that you could just ask questions. It's something you can clarify through questioning. I'm just saying that there are a host of ways that disclosures come, and that's what I want to establish first in this conversation. Disclosures are easy to miss because many times they are messy, they are coded, they are delayed or incomplete. And the reason for this is because this is about children, number one, and children are still developing in so many ways. Also, child sexual abuse is about power imbalance, which means there is a reality of fear, force, and threat. And we talked about power imbalance in our earlier episode. The relationship between adults and children is already a power imbalance. There's already a power imbalance in that relationship because adults are bigger, adults have more power in a child's space, adults have more influence. So there's that reality that there could actually be fear, force, and threat within this relationship. Child sexual abuse is also about the violation of trust or the abuse of trusted relationships, which also introduces fear once again, manipulation, and even love, even the love a child may have for the abuser who may be a parent or a close member of the family. So the reason for the indirectness is just back to the subject of the multidimensional reality of why children don't tell, which we talked extensively about in episode 2 of our podcast. Another point I want us to note in this introductory episode is that disclosures follow a process and rarely happen all in one moment. There's always a build-up to a child's disclosure. And the delicateness of this is that unconsciously many parents and caregivers of children actually cut this process short before it gets to the final stage of full disclosure. Let me give you an example. So the first stage of the disclosure is a concept called testing the waters. In this stage, children begin to test your reaction with small hints. They just tell you something about a child at school, a child that is going through a problem that is likely the problem they are going through, just fictionalized. They could ask an indirect question, anything like that. Now imagine, I'm trying to paint a picture of how you could unintentionally break the process. So you've just come back from work and your child is seated by a corner, and then suddenly he or she raises their head and says, "Mommy or Daddy, what if we look for another house and just go far away?" Now imagine that you've been experiencing a housing situation and your big brother or this woman from your workplace just gave you the first floor of their house to live in. I'm raising the stakes deliberately because this is the reality of child sexual abuse victims, the perpetrators and the caregiver. This is the reality of that triangle. There's always a connection between the perpetrators and the caregivers, and often it is a connection you can't imagine giving up. So back to that question, imagine that. Depending on how you've wired your parenting and the posture you have with your children, you're likely to miss that or to dismiss that. You're likely to tell them off and let them know that, in fact, they should get used to it because you'll be there for a long time. Now imagine that the twist is that the house owner is the one harming that child, and they haven't said anything about the abuse to you yet, but they were asking you that question in order to be able to gauge what would happen if they were to tell you something like that. So what you don't know in that moment is that unconsciously you failed an exam you didn't realize you were writing. So that's the whole concept of testing the waters. And before I quickly move on, a better way to answer that question would have been to say, "That's interesting. Why do you say that?" Which they will likely say no reason to. They'll likely say they don't have a reason for saying that. Then you can follow up by asking again, "Is there something you want to tell me? You know I'm on your side and you can tell me anything to just invite questioning or curiosity." They'll likely still not say anything. Then you can go ahead and say, "I don't have a plan to move yet, but if there was ever to be anything about this place that is unsafe or uncomfortable for you or me, I would figure out a way for us to move out. If you just need a change of environment, that time will come." So if you listen closely to my response, you'll notice the pattern I adopted. Open-mindedness and curiosity first, then direct, gentle questioning, and lastly, a deposit of my commitment to that child's safety. I would also advise you to stop there. I would suggest you still take some time to study that child more carefully and that environment, and then revisit that conversation much later to be sure that it was just ordinary and there was nothing beneath the surface. After testing the waters, children can progress from there to telling you about the abuse partially. And then after that, that same child may recant it. That is, they may disclose and later take back their words. They can say that it did not happen like they said, or that it was all in their heads, or maybe that they imagined it. Many times this is done to protect themselves, especially if someone is threatening them or someone has told them that they're in trouble because they said that. It could also be done to preserve the relationship they have with the abuser, who may be a family member, or to avoid the fallout of the disclosure, especially if at that point of partial disclosure, the family has already had a big visual reaction, a big reaction that the child has seen. The child is already seeing that if I chart this path, it is going to get very bad. A child can also recant. And all of this can actually cast doubt on the credibility of the story. But children rarely lie about abuse. They may not be able to explain the situation clearly, but it's rare for a disclosure to be false. Very rare. If a child is talking, something has definitely made them uncomfortable. Sometimes again, children also say nothing is happening to them, even when there are signs that something is actually happening or something did happen. And this denial can be because the child really does not remember that has happened. Or it can also be that the child has entered a psychological defense state where they disassociate from what is happening. They compartmentalize what is happening and deal with it like a split reality that is not theirs, or a stage of fragmentation. We'll talk about this in later episodes, where it feels like they're experiencing mental glitches, the way you would watch a movie and then suddenly something skips and you did not hear what was happening there, you did not see what was happening there, and then it jumps to another scene. So they can also experience something like that where they remember things in bits but don't remember other parts of the abuse. Children can also minimize the abuse in their disclosure. All of these are patterns that emerge and have emerged through studies and research and listening to survivors. it has been seen that survivors can recant, they can deny, and they can minimize. They can tell you half of it and leave the rest, and they can give you a tip of the iceberg of what is really happening in their disclosure, and that is all. So disclosures are often a build-up or a process, like I said, and not a moment. Many times it begins with a partial disclosure, and then the second or third telling may be more complete or confident. Or it may even contradict the first. And this is easy to picture. It's easy to picture that contradiction, because if a child minimized the weight of the fact of the first abuse, the second and third retailing will be different. Maybe they are more safe, maybe it's a different person, maybe it's a different environment, or maybe even the abuser is out of the picture. So if you don't show up with curiosity, presence, awareness, and a verbal, clear commitment to their safety, it's easy to miss all of this as well as cut the process short. And the younger the children, the more coded the signal. There are different ways that disclosures come. Disclosures can be accidental. That means that the child did not plan to say that. It just came out maybe during a conflict, or they were playing with their teddy bear in a way that makes an adult realize, that's not normal. So the idea of accidental disclosure just encompasses all the different ways that adults come to learn about abuse in ways that the child did not intend. And most disclosures happen like this. There are also disclosures that are triggered by something. Whether it's a movie, maybe everybody's watching a movie and suddenly something plays out, an abuse situation plays out, and probably that movie gives language to something that the child had experienced that the child may not have even recognized as something dangerous or something bad. So that can trigger a disclosure. Disclosure can also be triggered by the news. A child can hear of another child who's been harmed by an abuser, and that could cause the child to come say something. A church sermon can also trigger a disclosure. A story can trigger a disclosure. Anything that just suddenly makes a child able to articulate what happened, or the reality of someone getting into trouble, like I said, anything that gets that child able to come into that space where they say this happened or that happened, that is a disclosure that is triggered. There are also guided disclosures where an adult creates the right environment and the trust and space for that to happen. So maybe it may be based on suspicion, like when a teacher has been discovered as a perpetrator, the school could have every single person in class visit the guidance counselor, or for that guidance counselor to have a gentle, investigative conversation with everybody in class just to make sure that that person that has been suspected has not harmed anybody. So in that case, there's an intentional curation of the environment that allows for that person or that child to be able to feel safe enough to share their story. There's also another form of disclosure where an offender has been caught with someone else or exposed, and in the process of that, it is discovered that another child had been harmed. So in the process of us finding that Mr. A or Miss B had harmed someone in this class, conversations have gone on, and now we've realized that at a particular time, around the time that the other child had also been harmed, that there was also a connection with this other child. So that leads everyone like a trail to find that there's likely also been a situation here. Most times when children are asked in that kind of situation, often the answer is yes, and often that is how that disclosure comes to fore. Children can also disclose non-verbally through all the forms I mentioned earlier, like through drawings, changes in behavior, sleep disturbances, a refusal to go near someone, like the story. All of that are non-verbal ways that children disclose abuse. Before I close out this chapter of our journey, I want to draw your attention to some attitude and mindset that I can guarantee would make you miss a disclosure. So if you think if it really happened, then they would have said it clearly. That's something that can make you miss a disclosure that is actually happening or unfolding before you. Because trauma shows up in hints. Trauma shows up in the discomfort. Trauma shows up in confusion. Is not a linear path, like I've been saying on the podcast over and over. It's not a linear path. It's not something that you can just see like a graph and say it's going to go up at a particular time, it's going to come down. You're dealing with human beings, even though they are children, and they have their own unique response to problems and to challenges. And so and they have their own unique psychological makeup and everything that is going to make that process unpredictable. So if you think that if it really happened, they would have said it clearly. And then, of course, like I said, we're dealing with children fundamentally who don't have enough language and enough of everything that it takes to be able to articulate the weight of what has occurred. So if you think like that, you're going to miss it. If you also think that they are too young to know what they are saying, you will miss a disclosure, because children may not have fancy words. Children may not have everything, but one thing that children are good at from the moment they come out from the womb, from the moment they arrive in this world, one thing children are excellent at doing is expression, and they always express what they're experiencing. If you also think that they're just being dramatic or they're looking for attention, that is a sure way to miss a disclosure. You'll miss this because this mindset makes it easy for you to dismiss a genuine cry for help. In fact, the more sensitive your child is, the more I think you should be watchful of them. Because when children are naturally sensitive, it is very easy for you to develop a bias towards them. It's very easy for you to see them moody or see them displaying cues that would have been helpful, and for you to just look at them and mentally tell yourself that person is always like that. That child is always like that. So whenever you experience a child like that, whether it's in school, as a teacher, as a parent, it's important that you consciously shift your mind and make it a deliberate shift to make sure that you've not built a bias around this child, a bias that can also affect your ability to spot when they're in serious trouble. If you also think that that can't be true, if you think in your mind that it's not possible that that person they are talking about, or that person that is popping up in your instinct as harming a child, if you think it can't be true that that person is doing something harmful, then you'll miss a disclosure, because loyalty and shock are two emotions that cloud judgment. Knowing someone in one capacity or in another capacity or in another context does not make them incapable of abuse. Not at all. It doesn't. So if you think that, you will definitely miss a disclosure and you will minimize one even if you wait to come to you. If you think that a child brought up a disclosure or brought up an issue and did not bring it up again at another time, if you think that just because they did that, then it wasn't serious, you will also miss abuse and miss a disclosure, because children test the waters, like I said. If the first hint is ignored or dismissed, many times that's how they stop trying to be heard. Many times that's how they stop making effort to reach you, to get you to understand them. So I hope that everything I've shared with you on this episode made it easier for you to understand the nature of these disclosures. This episode was just the beginning. It was my way of bringing you into the often misunderstood world of disclosures. As I prepare to leave you with these words, I just want you to remember that many times disclosures are delayed, so it's normal for children to not have said anything. Disclosures can also be coded, like I said, incomplete and even recanted. It doesn't mean it's not true. It doesn't mean it was all in their head. It doesn't mean they're no longer credible. So don't look out for a confession. Don't look out for them to say they were harmed directly. Watch for subtle cues and listen to children beyond their words. If we want to be people who protect children, then we must be people, or we must become people who listen with our heart and our minds fully in. We must become people who don't assume that children will know how to tell the truth in the ways that we expect them to say it. Because the truth is that many children are speaking just not in the language that we've been listening for. For this week's call to action, I want you to reflect on 2 questions. And those questions are you the kind of adult a child could safely talk to? Are you the kind of adult a child can safely or could safely talk to? And can you remember a time you feel as though a child was telling you something, but you didn't know that was a disclosure? And these are 2 very important reflective questions, especially the last one, because it also helps you to know if this information has helped you to identify, if it has formed a framework in your head that can immediately spot and identify a disclosure when you do experience it or when you are in that moment. In our next episode, we'll explore how to respond to disclosures and how not to. For now, thank you for being here. Thank you for 10 whole weeks of working with us on this podcast. Thank you for listening, for sitting with the discomfort, and for being open to learning and relearning what it means to truly keep children safe. We're still inviting volunteers to join our mission. You'll find the link to join us in the descriptions. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Intercept CSA and subscribe wherever you listen to your podcast so you can get notifications and be one of our first listeners. Remember, together, we can intercept abuse and protect the children we all care about. Together, we can intercept child sexual abuse for future. Until next week, see you.